This is a production of Cornell University.
As Matt said, I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been working with organic agriculture for over 20 years now. I actually started my career down at New Mexico State University. And really struck me the role of organic in terms of building regenerative ag systems and addressing many of the challenges we face, not only as a nation, but globally in terms of having a healthy, nutritious food supply, supporting farmers, supporting small family farmers, supporting beginning farmers, and supporting soil health. Organic is all about soil health. It's all about building our soil, improving our soil resources, and truly is the first regenerative agriculture. So as we look at maintaining and forwarding organic practices, it's all grounded in regenerative agriculture. So I've been working in organic no-till since that first time in New Mexico, looking at how we create systems that can help preserve our soil, build our soil. So that's been over 20 years now, and I've learned a lot in the process. Still a lot to learn. Very exciting to continue to do the research. As Matt said, a lot of the research that we have been doing is in partnership with Cornell University here in New York. And for those of you that don't know, Wisconsin tends to be considered a flyover state. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Wisconsin versus the Corn Belt. There's a lot of similarities to agriculture in New York. We have hillier landscapes, a lot of organic farmers are farming ridges and valleys, a very diverse agriculture, smaller farms. We have organic dairies and organic vegetables, organic grain farms. And New York and Wisconsin always tend to be competing for that second place or first place position in terms of number of organic farms and number of dollars from organic grain and dairy farmers. They're always jockeying for that leadership position. We won't talk about California if we don't count, but Wisconsin and New York really super close. So the research that I'm presenting, I think is really relevant to New York as well. And Matt and his team can certainly give context and talk about that in our tables as well. I think the biggest difference in Wisconsin is we're not farming rocks like you guys. So our soils are really good and we don't have as many rocks. But in terms of the size of farms, resources we have, and even environmental, it's really, really similar. Have to give credit, this presentation was actually made by my research scientist, Ben Rockmiller. So super grateful to Ben and all the work he's done with data analysis, and just want to give him a huge amount of credit for pulling this together. All right, so starting with organic no-till soybeans, and I just wanted to stress as well, a lot of my work is in organic no-till. I think it has a really strong place as we look forward, not only to organic grains, but looking at other organic feeds, and livestock production, as well as organic vegetables. But I certainly am not promoting organic no-till as the silver bullet. There's been many long-term studies that have compared organic and conventional side by side. And as I mentioned, organic truly is regenerative agriculture, the first regenerative agriculture, even with judicious tillage, that integration of crop diversity and cover crops. Organic farms still are building soil organic matter. So I don't want to demonize tillage. I think there's a place for tillage. I think strategic tillage is important. I think we can have very good organic farms that are stewarding the soil with tillage. If all tillage is part of the system, and organic no-till should be considered as part of the system. And when you look at designing rotations and how do you build these different ecological tools together to create a system that we can lower inputs, we can be building nitrogen on the farm, we can be lowering our need for different insecticides or other aspects, even with organic certified. It's all about building the system. So think about organic no-till as part of the system. So I first started working in organic no-till soybeans. It's been about 20 years ago now, and had the opportunity to work with Jeff Moyer. So learned a lot from the Rodale Institute and what they have been doing in terms of pioneering this technique. Over the past 20 years, I think we have a lot of success in the organic soybean system. I wouldn't say we have it dialed in. I don't know if anything in organic can be dialed in because of the ecological nature of the system. But this is a system that's workable, and we do have more and more examples of farms that are making this work as part of their soybean approach on their farm. And looking at market opportunities in terms of organic grains, we're still importing the majority of organic soybeans. And I know that in Wisconsin, at least, organic farmers aren't thrilled about organic soybeans. But it is a sector of the organic grain market that there is opportunity for growth, there is opportunity for more domestic production. So looking at these different tools to make organic soybean production more feasible is also important. So the system with organic no-till soybeans. The first step is rye establishment. So we typically are using a winter annual cereal grain as the tool for weed management. Winter annual rye tends to be the most consistent performer in terms of winter annual cereal grain. It produces a lot of biomass, it overwinters well, and tends to, I think, impose a bit more allelic cap in the system that can also help with weed suppression. One of the key aspects of this system is this planting date for winter rye. And as we see how this system has failed on farms where farmers are seeing issues, oftentimes it is tied to this first step. And if you don't get that first step right, the system is going to have a high risk of failure. So this first step of planting that rye on time, in Wisconsin and New York, I wouldn't push it past mid-September. So this really requires to be successful and redesign of the system more broadly. Oftentimes in Wisconsin, organic grain farmers are planting soybeans after corn. Maybe you could get a rye planting date of mid-September if you're coming in after corn silage. But typically, to get that early planting date, you need to think about redesigning the system, including winter annuals, or summer cereal grains, other winter annual cereal grains, and finding something that can be harvested so that we can target this mid-September planting date. The other key, two other keys in terms of what to look for to make this system successful at this early step is to go into a field that has the right weed pressure. So this is not a cleanup method in fields. So it's not a way that we can clean up weed fields. And it also is not the best method for suppressing perennial weeds. So thistle, quackgrass. So targeting which fields you're going to try organic no-till and choosing fields that don't have excessively high weed pressure and that aren't struggling with perennial weeds. The other part of this first step that is key is a seeding rate. So we're not using a seeding rate for a typical rye cover crop coming in after corn, which is maybe a bushel and a half per acre. We need to bump this up to get the ground cover and the biomass needed to suppress weeds. And that's usually around the 3 bushel an acre range. So investing in that higher seeding rate is going to pay off in terms of weed suppression later. So 3 key aspects of this early step that's going to set you up for success. The rye winter starts to grow again in April and May, and we want to terminate at the stage of antecedent. So you can see where the flowers are coming off the rye heads. You can run your hand across the rye heads and see the yellow pollen. Sometimes when you're roller flipping, there's clouds of pollen that will come off as tractors driving over the field. Heard stories about it actually clogging the tractor. But that's the stage we're targeting. Going into early, you're not going to be able to get the mechanical termination of rye that's going to create that rye mat. Going into late, you're going to potentially have issues with viable rye seed, which especially is an issue if you're growing other cereal grains within the rotation, especially food grade grains, but I've even heard of feed grade grains having issues with some of that viable rye seed causing contamination in that cereal grain based cash crop. So typically, the stage in thesis, we're seeing the rye flower heads. That's going to occur around Memorial Day, June 4th. So that's where we're targeting for mechanical termination of the rye and the planting date of the soybeans. So early June. And this is not an uncommon photo. This is a photo of our research field at Arlington, Wisconsin, so South Central Wisconsin. That rye mat does an excellent job suppressing weeds. So we don't have to go through and do cultivation. The rye takes care of the weed management. We can roll the rye, plant it, and then let it go for the season. And then harvest in October. This system does push back maturity, so it does require to be ready to harvest in late October, early November, to be able to reach the right stage of soybean maturity. So different sorts of roller permits we've tried. We've tried the rodeo model, which many of you may have seen and associated with this. This is a model that is manufactured by a more local machine manufacturer in South Central Wisconsin, but lots of different options in terms of roller permits as well. We haven't seen a huge difference in terms of performance. I think it really there's options that can work for farmers. So why organic no-till? It is something, as we're seeing more extreme weather, seeing more heavy rain events, it's important as a mitigation tool for soil loss. So in the upper Midwest, in the Corn Belt, on average, we've lost a third of our topsoil. And that topsoil is very, very difficult to regain. We certainly can build soil organic matter within organic systems, but to regain this degree of topsoil will take decades, if not centuries. So it's an important resource that we need to be very aware in terms of how our management is affecting the maintenance of that resource and how we can protect it. So these are some pictures that we've seen in terms of some topsoil loss with some recent heavy rain events. You can see without that soil covered how that this surface erosion of the soil versus if you have that dry mat, how that protects and mitigates the impacts of those heavy rains, keeps that soil in place, and also helps maintain soil moisture throughout the growing season by essentially acting as a barrier to prevent evaporation and cooling the soil as well. Some other examples within our fields where there's the open ground, seeing where there's visible signs of erosion, versus in organic no-till where you have that soil protected. So you can see the seed treatment side by side and how that soil is actually washing and being stopped by the organic no-till treatments. So it does also help from a labor perspective. And from the organic farmers I work with that utilize this technique, it's often not all their organic soybean acres, but some of their organic soybean acres, because it helps spread out the labor. And especially in seasons like this past season in Wisconsin, where we were hammered with rain. So to find those windows where you can get out and cultivate was near impossible. And by having a certain degree of acres that you don't have to cultivate, it allows you to more effectively manage those acres that you do need to cultivate. So in a typical tillage-based system in Wisconsin, we typically have 2 to 3 pre-plant tillage passes, and then up to 3 to 5 weed management passes after planting with our blind cultivation, time weeding, rotary hoeing, and our row cultivation. This cover crop mulch system, this organic no-till system, basically cuts out all that need for pre-plant tillage as well as post-plant tillage. So a lot of trips across the field, and this is where a lot of the economics pay off is less labor, less wear and tear on your equipment, less passes over the field, so less fuel costs, and also we think about mitigating action by eliminating that degree of passes over the field and also be beneficial that way. So again, if you look at the cost of the system and how the economics pay off by having the labor and fuel costs reduced by 50%, that definitely shows up in the pocketbook. So yields, and this is where again there's risk in the system that I think when we look at how this is actually executed on farms, to have it more diversified in terms of the approach and maybe not having all your acres of organic no-till is smart, as we see more unpredictable weather patterns happen from year to year. So this is over the past decade that we've been doing organic no-till. We've been doing it longer, but just showing the last 2 years of data. These are the yields, bushel per acre. Green bars are no-till, blue bars are tilled. So you can see we're typically averaging between 40 and 65 bushel an acre in those two systems. And when we look at this black line, that is precipitation, the amount of rainfall in inches that is we're seeing during the growing season, you can see that when we have less rainfall, when this bar is lower, that's when you see more of a difference between those two lines. So in years we have sufficient precipitation, like in 2024, we could actually exceed the yields of traditional, conventional, organic soybeans. Because we have that weed management tool in place, we're not struggling with getting out and cultivating during the wetter weather. And we're having a system where we can better manage weeds. So when you see when these black bars at its high points, there's very little yield difference. But where the system breaks down and where there's risk is in those extremely dry years, because the rye essentially acts like a straw and sucks up a lot of that soil moisture. And planting into a dry situation within the rolled rye, the soybeans definitely struggle. So by having some acres in traditional organic soybeans that are cultivated and some in organic no-till, you can kind of buffer against some of this uncertainty in terms of weather patterns. So profitability, looking at profitability system, these are some kind of back of the envelope numbers that have been put together, comparing the organic no-till system, some of the costs in terms of the different field operations, as well as the different inputs in terms of seed. Assuming that even an organic field operation, we're typically going to be putting in some rye cover crop, but at that lower seeding rate. So because of the fact we have few field passes and lower variable costs, particularly in terms of some of the seed costs and some of the passes over the field, that we can see that although there's tight margins, that if we can close that yield gap, that organic no-till can outperform organic tillage-based systems with respect to the economics of this system. So looking at, where does that pay off? If we can get the yield within about 5 bushels an acre, we typically see the economics of the system paying off. So one of the things that Ben did this summer, which was super exciting, is to see how the practices that we've been researching at our research station actually translate onto farms. Oftentimes we do at a research station, I would criticize of working in a little bit of a bubble. We might not be seeing the realities of what's happening in our organic farm. So Ben went out to organic farms that were using organic no-till to try to understand what farmers were doing with organic no-till, what challenges that farmers were facing with the implementation of the system, and to see if there's any trends that we're seeing across the farm sites that are using the system. So he did this across a multi-state area in the upper Midwest. He looked at rye management, soybean management, the equipment that farmers were using, and collected a range of data looking at soil nutrients, rye biomass, weed biomass, and soil standing yield, or soybean standing yield. So what he found, so farmers that were using this, he went to about 14 farms. So preceding crop, like I mentioned, crop rotation is one of the trickier aspects of the system to dial in. You have to think of it as a system and what you're going to be planting before the soybeans. What he was finding was that most of the farms were using some sort of cereal grain that they were harvesting as a cash crop. Many of them were coming in following winter wheat. Barley was another one, oats. In Wisconsin, where we can get some really high yielding corn varieties for silage that we can get off earlier. One farm was using corn silage as a preceding crop, and only one was using corn for grain. But having these cereal grains as a preceding crop allowed for the farms that were using the system to get and hit that early planting date for the rye. So the vast majority with this rotation were hitting that early September planting date. A couple of them were pushing it out further, but also they were also able to get that higher rye seeding rate to make the system work. The rye varieties they were using, NP Gardner and Aroostook, are both some earlier maturing varieties, so varieties that are a little bit more adapted to the system, so they can get that earlier termination date. And many of them were also applying manure before rye. And I think this is also an important part of the success, is having adequate fertility for that rye cover crop to get the biomass needed for weed suppression. So the vast majority were treating that rye as a crop and adding some fertility prior to planting. Many of them were planting before crimping. So this doesn't mean planting weeks earlier before crimping, but instead essentially going over the field twice, going through the standing rye to plant the soybeans, which helps facilitate good seed to soil contact because you're not having to get the planter through that thick rye mulch and then coming in and crimping right afterwards. There were a couple that were crimping first and trying to plant through that mulch, but the vast majority were planting first and then crimping. Soybean planting date, kind of that range in that latter part of May to the early part of June. Those that were doing it mid-May probably were using a technique where they're planting around the root stage of rye and then letting the soybeans germinate and then crimping over that. Soybean seeding rates, and this is reflective of some really great research coming out of Cornell, is that in this system, going to the heavier soybean seeding rates is also important for the success and resilience of the system. So even going up to about 240,000 seeds per acre. Many of them, most of them were on 30-inch rows, a couple of them were on narrower row spacing. And about half of them or more were doing some in-season weed management to help manage some of the stages in the system. So looking at the performance, many of them were targeting, the vast majority were targeting, or being able to achieve the rye biomass that we need to make the system work, which is about 8,000 pounds per acre. So having those earlier planting days, that fertility, and that heavier rye seeding rate was working in their favor, and they were getting the rye biomass seed suppression. Some of the farms were struggling with weed suppression, as evidenced by this higher number, but most of them were getting decent weed suppression. And a range of different soybean stands. So some of them were struggling a bit with getting that good seed soil contact and getting the soybean stand needed. But the soybean yields 46 bushels an acre. We consider that a pretty decent soybean yield in Wisconsin. So farmers were having success in this system. The farmers that were surveyed, the farmers that were visited, were having success in terms of getting good biomass, getting good weed suppression, and getting good soybean yield. So it's really exciting to see that the systems that we've been working so hard to research at Wisconsin and Cornell we're seeing in terms of success in the field. So photographs of the differences. So here we can see a high biomass rye field, and just what a difference having that heavy rye biomass where you can't see any soil versus inadequate biomass and just how many weeds are breaking through. So visual demonstration of how important setting up a system for that high rye biomass is. And then looking at the inconsistencies in stands. So having this excellent soybean stand, paying attention to planting, planter setup, paying attention to being able to get that seed in the ground versus the inconsistent plant stand. So rye biomass, and this is something we see in our research as well, was the most important predictor for success. So dialing in the system, choosing your fields, getting the rye in early, getting that rye seeding rate correct. That's what the most important aspect of having this work on your farm. Increases in rye biomass tended to decrease wheat biomass. As rye biomass increased, soybean yield increased, and the soybean yield was strongly correlated to wheat biomass. And this we see in the tilled system as well. If we don't get our weed management dialed in, that's when our yields are going to suffer. The wheat biomass was dominated by a few species. So these are species that we struggle with in the upper Midwest, giant ragweed, giant foxtail. That's been a really persistent issue in recent years for a lot of land grain farmers, as well as yellow foxtail. Planter setup, really key in this system to make it work. Soybean emergence is a challenge with increasing rye biomass. So we need that rye biomass to get the weed suppression. Does make planting a challenge. So this is what we might see if we crimp first and don't have the planter set up. We have seeds that are resting on the rye biomass, and those seeds are going to not germinate and contribute to those poor stands. So some setup considerations, if you're going to do this, want to have the ability to cut and navigate through the rye residue to open the furrow and reduce that hairpinning where that rye is essentially just pushed into the planting row. Have sufficient down pressure to push through the mulch layer and place the seed in the appropriate depth. And we want to have the ability to close that seed furrow. So we've done a lot of research with ag engineer Brian Luck to see how we can overcome these issues. So looked at different down pressures, different seeding rates, still on a little bit on the low side, but a range of seeding rates as well as different coulters and closing yields. And from what we've seen, how that translates into yield, again, to remind you, if there's different letters following these values, it means that they're statistically significantly different, so that we can have confidence that, yes, these treatments are having an effect on what we're measuring. What we saw was that, again, when we're looking at what to do with the soybean planting phase to make this work, bumping up your seeding rates will translate into higher yields. Down pressure, we did see a numerical difference, but not a significant difference between the down pressures, and as well as coulter versus no coulter in this study, as in the closing yields as well. So the higher seeding rate is improving plant stand and grain yield. Higher down pressure and holding use seem to improve this plant stand, but didn't translate into yield. Some relationship between soybean emergence and grain yield from our research stations. The research stations at Arlington, we can get really high biomass, and that is it's definitely a challenge in terms of getting the soybean established. So soybean emergence translated into grain yields within these locations. Rye biomass is exceeding 10,000 pounds per acre and lower soybean emergence, strong relationship to grain yield. So this indicates potentially that the yield gap could be overcome by improving soybean emergence. So this coulter style matters. This is some of the research we were doing with Dr. Locke, looking at coulter waviness and how that relates to seed placement and soybean plant stand. So looked at several different coulters, straight versus ripple versus 13 wave versus 8 wave versus no coulter. And what we found was that the results differed per year. So having the environmental conditions that's going to affect the degree of difference you see with these different coulters. In 2023 versus 2024, you can see 2023 was an extremely dry year versus last year we had more steady rainfall, particularly early in the season. What we did find overall, though, was that with the planter setup in this system, using straight edge coulters was beneficial in terms of being able to get a good seed soil contact in the plant stand. And that hairpinning was significantly reduced. So setting up your planter for these systems using straight edge coulters is beneficial. We also found that the straight edge coulters were beneficial in terms of having reduced weed pressure within that planting row. So straight edge coulters have several benefits with respect to the system. And how this translates into grain yield, we did not see a difference in terms of the grain yield, but in terms of, again, the weed suppression and the stand. So I'm going to turn now for the rest of my talk about some of the research with reduced till corn. Whereas, and again, we saw this translated into the on-farm study we did, organic no-till soybeans is definitely a system that can work. If you're planning how to plant the rye, how do you design a rotation, getting the planter set up, dialed in, organic no-till soybeans are a viable and profitable system for organic grain farmers. Organic reduced till corn is something that I would say is not quite ready for prime time at this point. There's a lot of exciting research, a lot of exciting promise, and we're hearing more stories of farmers that are seeing some degree of success. If anyone would want to try organic no-till corn, I would recommend doing it on a very, very small scale, just to see how it works on your farm, 2 to 10 acres. This is absolutely not something that would do over a significant number of acres. We've tried a couple different approaches to organic no-till corn, roller crimping and a living mulch system. So roller crimping, we're mirroring what we're doing with the soybeans, using a winter annual cover crop planted in the fall and then terminating that mechanically in the spring. Living mulch systems, looking into using a legume, whether it be red clover or other clovers or alfalfa, and using different ways of suppressing that living mulch, so that legume that's been planted a previous year or previous years before the corn phase. And essentially managing that mulch to limit competition with corn. So in the roller crimp system, we're typically using rye and vetch, both winter annuals. The benefits, these systems tend to be more weed suppressive. So we get more of that weed control aspect of the system that we're looking for. The cover crop terminates, so we can mechanically terminate this and will stay as a killed mulch. So there's no competition with nutrients and water while the soybeans are growing. Vetch, if we can overwinter vetch consistently and get the biomass we need, vetch can supply a significant amount of nitrogen to the system, which is a limiting factor in terms of corn productivity within these no-till systems. Higher yield potential so far, as evidenced in a research trial. So it's a bit more consistent in terms of the performance of the system. Risks, they do require later planting date of the corn. Rye can be a reservoir for, or a host for armyworms, so there's more insect pressure within these systems. Hardiness of vetch seed, so that seed can have persistence across multiple seasons, so it doesn't all germinate the first year of planting, and if there's escapes in terms of the vetch seed, that can be persistent in subsequent phases of the crop rotation. And whereas the vetch can produce a lot of nitrogen, it's not necessarily available when the corn needs it, so that can be a challenge as well. The living mulch system, planting dates are not as dependent, so potentially because we're not waiting for that stage of crop maturity for mechanical termination, so flowering for both antecedents for rye as well as a flowering early concept for vetch, we could theoretically come in as early May and plant into these living mulch systems. Armyworm is less of a concern. Armyworm is not as attracted to legumes as it is to grasses. Less hard seediness. That is a concern of persistence into subsequent crop phases, and an opportunity to utilize that cover crop as a forage. So in our dairy systems, could be a very attractive option as a way to graze or to develop alternative forages, or even come in after an alfalfa stand. Risks, there's a lot more competition in these systems because our cover crop is actively growing. Not as much contribution because that nitrogen that's being fixed by the legume is being used by the legume itself. More variability in yield and in-row weed control can be an issue. Some of the yields that we've seen. So we've been tracking these for less years than our organic no-till soybeans. So we have a good 5 or 6 years under our belt in these systems. Some of the legumes we've used, red clover and alfalfa and yellow blossom sweet clover. So this is where there's promise, but there's still work to be done. So if you see the yields on that y-axis, we can have yields as low as 50 bushels an acre. But in some years, in some systems, we can see yields reaching 150, and we've even gotten closer to 180 in some of these systems. So in certain spots in the field. So there is evidence that there's potential to these systems. We can understand how to dial it in, what we need in terms of reducing competition and management. I still hold that there is a way to utilize these systems to reduce tillage in corn. The roller crib systems kind of see that similar variability in yield. Rye hairy vetch mix, we can see yields of corn anywhere from about 60 bushel an acre up to 150. And even a little bit higher if we're using just straight hairy vetch as the roll crop. So is this ready for on-farm adoption? Not sure, but really looking forward to continuing this research in partnership with farmers and cover crop breeders to see how can we make that yield of 150 to 180 bushel an acre more consistent. So some of our experiments, I know I'm getting very, very close to time. Looking at comparing different management tools and management intensities of the cover crops. So some baseline using pre-plant manure applications, planting red clover in mid-August. We are doing different ways of kind of strip tilling or modified strip tilling. So trying to minimize competition within the planting row of corn and getting good stand establishment. One of the things in the system that I think we can also look at more closely is the genetics. I think genetics, adaptation of the genetics of these systems are going to be key. I want to just have that point out that with that 150 bushel an acre yield, we're using very, very short season varieties of corn. So maybe it's not surprising that our yield potential is less. For in-season management, looking at fertility applications, at planting, making sure there's adequate nitrogen, and then some management of cover crop. So different tools we're using, undercutters to make those rows, different ways of suppressing through flame weeding, roller crimping, and high residue cultivation. So just looking at some yield-free systems, undercutting, and looking at strip tilling or clearing a planting row for the corn, I think that's going to be key. These yields are in big grams per hectare, but you can see with the undercutting, we do see a significantly higher yield. Flame weeding, we did see a trend towards higher yields with the flame weeding as well. That weed suppression, and then looking at inter-row crimping, high residue cultivation, seeing a less of a impact of those tools. But we did see trends towards lower plant stands with high residue cultivation, so risk of impacting the stand there. This is some newer research we've done. I'll wrap up with this. Using forage harvesters to manage alfalfa, and using some other strip tillage tools as well as the inter-row mower. So crop management here, risk clover seeded in August. We do some forage harvest, so utilizing that as a crop, as well as a living mulch, strip tilling in late May, planting that short season corn, doing some inter-row mowing to help with mitigating competition at a couple different stages, V2 and V4. So what we're finding here is that using some of these competition mitigation tools, we are seeing some benefit, particularly inter-row mowing, looking at what the potential nitrogen competition is or nitrogen uptake of the corn. So it does look like if we can mitigate some of that competition, it could be valuable, both within the red clover and alfalfa systems. Looking at corn yields. So this is where particularly looking at the inter-row mower as a way to help improve some of the corn yields by mitigating that competition. So yields here, not great, but we are seeing some impacts on management and definitely some promising results in terms of getting yields that would be considered acceptable. So just want to thank the organizers of the event. Thank you all for coming to our event. I want to point out our website. We have a great website with a lot of tools, lots of past videos, lots of different resources, case studies. We also have a link to a listserv that we have that facilitates farmer-to-farmer communication. Just again, a huge thank you to Ben Brockmiller for putting together this slide set, and to just the Silva and Ryan Lab team members in general for all their work with developing this research over the last several decades. So thank you.
Question in the back there?
Yes. What's the time for crimping when you plant to the standing rye?
Yeah, so planting, with the standing rye system, there's two ways that farmers are doing it. One is essentially planting into the standing rye at anthesis and crimping right over it. So it's done on the same day or within 24 hours. It's just planting into the standing rye to get better seed to soil contact. In some of our research that we did with trying to boost the earliness of the soybean planting date, what we're typically targeting in that system is getting the soybeans planted, and then to about the first true leaf stage, so about the V1. So we don't want to plant in there too early. So we're usually coming in around May 15th, which is usually around the boot stage of rye. And we don't crimp right away. So we'll go into the standing rye, plant at boot stage. That rye will continue to mature. The soybeans will come up in that standing rye, and then we'll roll over the soybeans at that early stage of maturity. If we push it too much earlier into May, the soybeans, they're kind of starved for sunlight under that rye canopy, and they can get really leggy and damaged. But if we do it about 2 weeks before anthesis, we do see some stand loss. But we have had years where that is advantageous in terms of the final yield. Farmers have had mixed success. We've had mixed success. I don't necessarily see enough benefit of that earlier planting date and crimping over the soybeans to justify that. I think it's a lower risk system to just plant it and crimp it in anthesis, but it is an option.
Just out of curiosity, what is your plant rate on your soybeans that you ran for these tests here, and what was the size of the soybean?
Yes, that's the size of the soybean. I am not sure. We're going at a lower seeding rate that I think is ideal, particularly with some of the research that's been done at Cornell University. So in these trials, we're usually, I think, at about 225, but I think bumping it up, and Matt can give his opinion, to 240 is probably a sounder recommendation.
225 is already much better than what's recommended in conventional production. I think, we've seen that, higher rates do pay, but 225 to 240 is kind of where we're seeing our the maximum or the greatest economic return then.
Yeah, we're usually like at a 1.6, 1.8 maturity group, but I'm not sure what the seed, but that's why I think variety trialing these systems and understanding the impacts of seed size and canopy and other factors is something we haven't touched upon yet.
Thank you. Was there any assessment done on the cosmetic nature of the soybeans?
Yeah.
If they're suitable for their island market?
I have not heard, and Klaus might have more experience there. I have not heard issues with, sorry, Peter. It took me a while to connect there. We haven't seen an issue. We haven't seen an issue with staining, but good point. Sorry for that. It took me a while to click there. So you guys have seen issues with, yeah, okay.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.